Middle East is home to some of the world's wealthiest countries per capita and many strategic partners of the United States, but it's also home to some of the world's most pressing humanitarian crises: proxy wars, regional power struggles, religious extremism, and deep historical animosities. It's a complicated region that U.S. foreign policymakers have long struggled to get right. This is Snack Break. I'm Aroop Mukharji, and today, to help us make sense of the shifting dynamics in the Middle East, is Dr. Tarek Masoud, an expert on Middle Eastern politics, democracy, and political institutions, professor of public policy, and the Sultan of Oman, professor of international relations at the Harvard Kennedy School, and the faculty director of the Kennedy School's Middle East Initiative. Tarek, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Aroop.
So, do people in the Middle East call it the Middle East? Because that would be weird to me.
It's interesting. So they do. They call it Sharq al-Awsat, which means the Middle East.
Right. Because it's the center, it's the cradle of civilization.
Absolutely.
They should call it the center, if anything, right?
They should call it the center. That's right. Maybe that just shows you how much we in the Middle East have internalized the colonial discourse. But yeah, in fact, we call it the Middle East. Sometimes you'll call it the Arab region. When we're talking, we'll usually say al-Mantiqa, the region. But yeah, Middle East is, in fact, one big newspaper in the Middle East is called the Sharq al-Awsat, the Middle East. So, yeah.
What used to be called Edward Said's Orientalism. It was
yes, the Orient.
In fact, many schools in the UK still have schools of Oriental studies that study the Middle East.
Yes, absolutely. And there's the American Oriental Society. I mean, there's actually, that term is not completely been eradicated.
And shifted to so far east.
Yeah.
So why is this part of the world important? I mean, people talk about it being the geographic pivot between Asia, Africa, and Europe. It's also the home to great sources of oil and energy. But this fracking revolution in the United States, we don't need that anymore, right? Why is this important?
Well, I think we can always use energy. I think it's important mainly because I'm from there, and no, just kidding. I think it's important to a lot of people in this part of the world for different reasons. So there are some Americans for whom the Middle East's importance, I think, stems from the fact that it is the cradle of the world's three Abrahamic religions, and in particularly Christianity, which is politically important here. And so I think that is a big part of the connection that a lot of Americans feel towards that part of the world. I mean, if your holy book is constantly referring to lands in the Middle East, it's inevitable that you would think that that place is of outsized importance. As you pointed out, the energy, the fact that much of the world's energy comes from that part of the world continues to make it important. And then I think there are knock-on effects of the previous era of Middle Eastern importance. So even if you're right that today, for example, the Middle East should be less important, we should be pivoting to Asia, et cetera, the fact is we've been engaged there for so long, and the U.S. foreign policy contributed to a lot of developments in that part of the world that then have knock-on effects. So, for example, Middle East is important because we face a challenge of religiously inspired terrorism, right? So that's going to make it continue to be important. We think we need to do something to counter violent extremism in that part of the world. And so that's another ongoing source of the region's importance. And that's why when you try to do something like a pivot to Asia, or you try to say, we're going to stop involving ourselves so much in the politics of the region, it's sort of like that line from Godfather 3, the minute I thought I got out, they pulled me back in. I didn't quote that exactly right, but you get the idea.
Yeah, so, but we've had a lot of failures in that part of the world. Are we worse at foreign policy there than we are elsewhere in the world? And if so, why?
That's a great question. I would say we're pretty bad at foreign policy everywhere right now. I don't know. I couldn't answer the comparative question. And also I want to say, look, my job is to criticize things. And I could find a lot of things to criticize about American foreign policy. The question is, could our policies in the region have been better? And that's a more open question. So let's talk about the mistakes, right, that you're talking about, and the mistakes that we've experienced in our lifetimes, the big one being the invasion of Iraq in 2003. And that was an epic error, and there were people who said this was a mistake, right, and was going to be a mistake. The question is, from our standpoint, was it an avoidable mistake? I mean, everything is ultimately avoidable, but forces pushing us towards that mistake, I think, were pretty irresistible. The fact is, it had been 2 years since 9/11, and there was I think, a psychological need on the part of a lot of people in our foreign policy establishment to do something, right? That there needed to be some fundamental change in that part of the world, and we, the United States, needed to demonstrate our power. Invading Afghanistan, that wasn't enough. We needed to do something big and bold. And I think if you're a voice saying, this is not going to come out right, this is going to be problematic for us, et cetera, it was very hard for you to get heard.
Yeah, we forget that was bipartisan.
It was totally bipartisan, and there are a lot of people today who actually give a lot of credit for revisiting their earlier remarks about that. But there are a lot of people today who, admit that this was a mistake. Public, intellectuals, et cetera, admit that this was a terrible mistake, but also were, beating the drums for this war, So I think it was really hard, and there were a lot of different rationales that you could have come up with to justify it. So one would be, look, Dick Cheney's argument was Saddam Hussein represents the most likely nexus between weapons of mass destruction and international terrorism. Now that turned out to be wrong, but I don't doubt that he actually believed that. For other people, it was after the Gulf War, the United States had given signals to the Shia population in Iraq that that if they rose up against Saddam Hussein, that they would be supported. And in fact, there was an uprising, and the United States didn't support it, and the Shias continued to suffer then under Saddam. So you could make the argument that really we need to make this right, and the way to make this right is to remove Saddam's boot off the neck of the Shias and, of course, of the average Iraqis. Right? Another argument that you could have made, and this was an argument I would have made. Luckily, I was a graduate student. Nobody cared about me, so I didn't make this publicly. But I admit, I too thought, well, if you're in Iraqi right now, you're suffering under sanctions. It's so miserable. If the invasion of Iraq and the removal of Saddam Hussein will finally change this terrible sanctions regime, then that can't be bad. So you could have made there were a lot of rationales for this policy. And the argument against the policy was an unattractive, unappealing argument, even if it was right? The argument against it was, look, Saddam Hussein is terrible, et cetera. But once you remove that authority, once you remove that power, you don't know what you're going to unleash. There's this line that Hosni Mubarak, in some tellings it's Hosni Mubarak, Egypt's former president, or Amr Moussa, who was, I think at the time, the chair of the Arab League, but one of them said, some Egyptian said a smart thing, right? Which was, if you invade Iraq, you are going to open the gates of hell, right? And if you're an American who both, feels the need to do something after 9/11, but also believes that everybody in the world has the potential for democracy, and all we need to do is release them from bondage, that argument is not going to really fly with you.
I mean, have you over the course since you were a grad student, have you moved further away from that sort of interventional, idealism about whether or not the U.S. actually has the ability to not only influence events but also control them afterward?
Yeah, I think I, like a lot of people, have become much less idealistic about the potential of outside powers, be it the United States or anybody else, to fundamentally change what goes on in a country, and particularly with respect to its regime type. But I have to say, even if I really interrogate my views, there's a lot of, I think there's a lot of contradictions that I still have to resolve. So, for example, I co-authored a book about the Arab Spring and why the Arab Spring, which is the season of revolution that happened in 2010 and onwards, late 2010, really starts in 2011, why that really didn't result in democracy except in this tiny country.
A little bit of a tease.
Yeah. What's the tease?
The Arab Spring,
yes.
For democracy, right? It didn't quite pan out the way that everybody thought it would.
Yes. I wouldn't describe it as a tease. I would more describe it as a crushing disappointment that has me in tears sometimes. But the question is, why didn't that work out? And when I co-authored a book about this, we really paid a lot of attention to domestic dynamics in these different countries. Well, you didn't have this, condition or that condition, et cetera, and not a lot of attention to the role of outside powers. And I think today, if you're looking at the Arab Spring and trying to come to terms with what happened and you're writing the history of the Arab Spring and the failure, you can't ignore the role of outside power. So David Kirkpatrick, the former Cairo bureau chief of the New York Times, just came out with a book about the Egyptian revolution, but he focuses a lot on the military's overthrow of Egypt's president in 2013. Egypt had a democratically elected president who was a pretty untalented guy, but nonetheless democratically elected. He was overthrown by the military in 2013. And Kirkpatrick does a lot of interviews in Washington and really finds that the military's decision calculus, the military's decision to overthrow that president was in fact influenced by signals they were getting from Washington. So I don't want to say that we can't influence, or the United States can't influence what happens abroad in other countries. But I do still believe that the United States cannot implant democracy, which is the argument that was being made with the Iraqi adventure. And I would go further and say, not only can the United States not implant democracy, but we also have to be real. It's not clear to me that the United States would want to implant democracy.
Yeah.
Right?
Sometimes it can be, well, as we've discovered in Iraq and in other parts, it can be destabilizing in a whole bunch of ways. What is the path for democracy? Is it something we want? And maybe more importantly, is it something folks in the Middle East want? And where's our evidence? And what does that path look like?
So let me take the first question first. Yeah. Is democracy something that people in the Middle East want? And I would say absolutely yes, with an asterisk. With asterisk being, look, by democracy, I would say decent government that recognizes and respects the bodily integrity of its citizens and that is accountable to the wishes of the citizenry. Now, what the exact, precise institutional form that takes is of less concern to me, right? But the fact is that do the people of the region want this? And I would say absolutely they want it. And I would go further and say they want it as much as you and I want it here. I really think this idea that the people of the Middle East do not want democracy or they want a strong hand to... I don't think that's a fundamental demand of the people. I think fundamentally they have the same mental machinery that everybody else has around the world, and it's natural to want freedom, accountability, and dignity. The second question is, does the United States want it? And I don't know. Yeah. Now, should the United States want it? I believe morally, yes. The answer should be we should always want democracy. Now, that will sometimes come at a cost to the United States. So, for example, I think just to bring it back to the Egyptian case and to bring it back to Kirkpatrick's account of how the United States wasn't totally opposed to the undoing of Egyptian democracy in 2013. I think part of that was because democracy had brought to power a political movement, affiliated political party that came out of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a pretty conservative and I would even go so far as to say anti-American organization. I don't think that's a controversial way of framing their foreign policy preferences. And so if you're an American policymaker and you're thinking about whether democracy is really in your interest, well, certainly in your short-term interests, you could say it isn't. We've got these people who are much less cooperative and much less flexible and much less attentive to the American interest. But you might also think, well, in the long term, maybe it's better for us to deal with governments there that are actually legitimate with their people. As opposed to governments that aren't.
I mean, there's this tension between, and I don't know if it's a false choice, but between stability and democracy. And that's often how it is pitched, I think, in the United States as well. We could support these horrible leaders who nonetheless do maintain some degree of stability. And if we don't have stability, then we have chaos and havens of terrorism, et cetera. Yeah. Do you see a trade-off there, or is it a false choice?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think that our studies of democracy and certainly of democratization reveal that in the initial period after or during a democratic transition, there almost always is a diminution of authority, of order, right? So, if I just think about, the Egyptian case after the Egyptian revolution, there was a lot of things started to fly that wouldn't fly. So you started even seeing street vendors where you wouldn't ordinarily see them, and crime was up, and So I think, when you move from a highly repressive authoritarian state to something that's more open, that openness is going to come with maybe some decay in order. And the question is, how do you limit that decay in order such that you don't get people saying, you know what, we wanted democracy, but God, it's been so bad for us. Maybe if the strong man shows up, we'll just accept it for now. So I think it's trivially true that in the short or immediate term, democratic transitions lead to some more instability. The point I might make, though, is that longer term, you might get more stability, right? You don't have to contend with if you can make it past that initial phase and you consolidate or root your democracy a little bit more firmly, you actually get a kind of more stable regime, right? And actually a regime that's more predictable, because all you have to do to know sort of how this regime is going to behave is kind of read public opinion in part. So,
unless it's the United States, I feel like Trump has given democracy a little bit of a bad name.
Well, it's interesting. I don't study the United States. I will say I believe President Trump is perhaps our first Egyptian president, just given his political style, really. Actually, the person in Egypt who reminds me most of President Trump is the former president of a football club in Egypt that my family roots for, who is just a completely outlandish guy, always on Twitter, insulting people, and ran for president in Egypt many times, or a couple of times, and never got anywhere. And I'm like, that guy has now gotten elected, but in America. So I do think you're right that in the United States, certainly Trump has given, people look at Trump and look at his unpredictability, right, and they think, wow, we used to, thinking now what the person in the Middle East or elsewhere in the world thinks, we used to view America as this very professional, its government is very professional, it pursues its interests, it's not given to whims, et cetera. And now we've got this person who seems to make foreign policy on the fly. I mean, that's a possible, view, but I will say in my, my brief conversations with people who are in the foreign policy apparatuses of those places, they would point you to the fact that there's actually quite a bit of stability in terms of the way the U.S. acts, particularly in the Middle East. There hasn't really been a dramatic change in U.S. Middle East policy. I mean, so maybe, I don't know, maybe that's a good thing, maybe that's a bad thing. But.
Well, I think it's time for a snack break.
All right, let's do it.
Your favorite snack is donuts and coffee.
I have a lot of favorite snacks. That was the one I could come up with when you asked me.
These are from a local donuttery.
Oh, wow. Thank you
There's
for
your
the
coffee called Blackbird Donuts.
Do you get like a kickback from them for mentioning them? Yeah,
I should actually. We'll see if they'll retweet it.
Yeah.
So they call themselves an artisanal donut shop, and they certainly make very pretty donuts. There's also so sweet and savory. I assume you have a sweet tooth.
I do, but that one looks like it has some everything spice on it.
So yeah, that's an everything not bagel but everything donut. And I don't know if you even want to have.
I would love to have it. The problem is it's got all the poppy seeds which then get stuck in your teeth.
You can get So we've got two regular glazed. There's a chocolate cake donut which is a denser donut. The one in the middle is actually. You got some.
Yeah, that's the one I'm interested in.
The one in the middle.
Yeah.
So that is. It's called a purple cow donut, and I picked it out.
People often call me that. Yeah.
I went to my undergraduate alma mater, Williams College. Their mascot is a purple cow, so I felt I had to get it.
Okay, then you got to eat that one.
No, we could. I'll have the glaze. We'll split it in half.
Okay, let's split it in half. Let's split a purple cow.
See what happens.
Yeah.
So
how does this work? You want me to help you out?
Yeah. Go for it.
Give me a fork, just so I don't get my. I always eat my donuts with a fork and knife.
Do you really?
No.
What?
No. Just reminded that Seinfeld episode where George Costanza eats the candy bar with a fork and knife, and the person says, "What are you doing?" And he says, "Well, how do you eat it? With your hands?"
That is hilarious.
Civilized person,
I'm a big fan of donuts.
Yeah.
I don't have them often enough. I've always felt that like every culture has certain standards in their cuisine.
Yes.
Every culture has like a breakfast egg dish. I feel like every culture has a rice pudding, and everyone has like a fried dough.
Oh, absolutely.
covered in sugar dish.
Yes, absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
in the United States, it's the donut. There's the churro, of course. In India, there's something called the jalebi. I don't know if you've ever
Yeah,
had it.
jalebi,
It's neon
Yeah.
orange.
We have something.
like a
We have zalebia, which is the
Oh.
same thing. Yeah.
It's just like
Yeah.
this weird squiggly
Yeah.
little like neon orange
Which
thing.
I
like eating
always
syrup.
hated as a kid.
Oh, I loved it as a kid.
And I now like it
Yeah?
because when it pairs really well with coffee.
Oh.
And so, that kind of hyper sickly sweet thing with a really strong, robust coffee is pretty appealing to me. I don't know if you guys noticed. I love this show. I love watching it. It's great. It's wonderful. I will also note for everybody that we actually are at Harvard and not in a Ramada Inn in Paterson, New Jersey. You can't tell, but the only thing I don't like is the chewing sounds. So I've been
really?
trying to,
See, I feel like the people on the podcast, because it's also, we would use it as a podcast.
Yeah, they like the chewing.
How else do you know that we're eating, that it's actually true?
Yeah,
That
I guess.
But maybe
well,
not.
I'm trying to block the mic when I chew, but
No.
but it's great. It's awesome. This donut was fantastic.
Yeah.
actually.
So this is really a lot of fun to eat. I'm a big chocolate fan.
Yeah. Oh, this is a good one. Yeah. So I grew up in Saudi Arabia, and one thing that we used to do after Friday prayers is we would actually go to a donut place called Mr. Donut and get donuts. So donuts are global, my man. Yeah.
Do you think donuts are America's softest power?
That's a good one. Did you practice that one, or you just came up with that? That's why you're a Harvard PhD student. Are they America's softest power? I guess so.
I mean, if we had more donuts, if we had more Mr. Donuts in the Middle East, would people like us more?
I don't know. They would certainly be fatter. Although we've got pretty high rates of obesity, actually, if you think about it, particularly in the Gulf.
Really?
Yeah, a lot of carbs. Taking a lot of carbs.
Is exercise not a part of the culture as much?
Well, I mean, I think, if you went to a Bedouin and you said, "Hey, are you guys exercising?" My whole life is exercise. I need a rest. So no, it isn't. And you don't have a very big outdoor culture. Although I'm sure, again, somebody watching this who's from Saudi Arabia could talk about how they, there's going into the desert and but it is very hot.
Yeah.
So the idea that I'm going to go out for a jog, I mean, that's not really
Thing.
That's not really a thing, And so you're not outside in the middle of the day unless you really need to be.
So on the topic of Saudi Arabia, one of the current challenges of U.S. foreign policy, it seems like the dynamics are shifting away from, maybe this is temporary, but what people talk about is less U.S. support of Israel, for instance, as a thorn. So much is around the Iran-Saudi Arabia rivalry, and the new crown prince in Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman. And I guess I want to first start off with does your experience in Saudi Arabia for so many years, does that inform, are there experiences there that inform how you think about that society, its ability to change in the way that Mohammed bin Salman, MBS as he's known, is arguing?
So I see two really big and important questions. So the first is that absolutely, as people probably know who are paying attention to the news in Saudi Arabia, the Saudi leadership, and particularly the crown prince of that country, Mohammed bin Salman, before he was known for ordering the execution of journalists, he was known as Saudi Arabia's reformer, the guy who wanted to take this country from being the kind of place that doesn't allow women to drive, that is, enthralled to a particular hyper-conservative brand of Islam. He's the guy who wanted to change those things and make the country more open, more liberal, et cetera. And the question is, could he succeed, right? And what do my experiences growing up in Saudi Arabia and studying it since then lead me to think? And then the second question you asked was more about sort of U.S. foreign policy and how the central obsession with U.S. foreign policy now seems to be, countering potential Iranian hegemony in the region. So let me take the second one first, and then we can talk about the first one. They're both great questions. So the second question, we are you're absolutely right. We are hyper focused about Iran. Iran is the kind of the rhetorical equivalent of the evil empire right now. And in a way, it's because two of our most important allies in the Middle East are obsessed with Iran. And they're two allies that haven't totally agreed on a lot of things, if you think about it, right? Israel, obsessed with Iran in part because the Iranians give them many reasons to be obsessed with them, not just because they support Hezbollah, which is the Shiite militia operating out of Lebanon, which is a continued threat and nuisance to Israel, but also because of their rhetoric. This is the country that hosted, Holocaust denial conferences and all kinds of things like that. Their leaders talk about removing Israel from the map. So of course you're going to be obsessed with Iran. Even if somebody like me might say, well, a lot of this is just Iran playing to the cheap seats and is not necessarily real, but nonetheless, it's you can understand why somebody would be obsessed with this country and view it as their primary threat. And then the Saudis are also obsessed with Iran, right? And you could make the argument that they have even more reason to be obsessed with Iran. Not only is there a relatively large minority, particularly in the eastern part of Saudi Arabia, that adheres to the same minority sect of Islam, Shiism, which is about 10% of Muslims globally, and who the Saudis are constantly worried about becoming a kind of Iranian fifth column. So you've got that. You've got the fact that Iran funds and supports militias in Yemen that are, that threaten Saudi Arabia, have even launched rockets into Saudi Arabia, et cetera. And you've got and you've got Iran trying to increase its influence in Syria by funding, by supporting the Assad regime, bringing Hezbollah in. So there's a lot of different ways in which you're the Saudis, you share a maritime border with Iran, you would be very concerned. And we in the United States, these are our two great allies. They both are obsessed with Iran. You could understand why that might influence our foreign policy decision making. My view is, I think the Obama administration had it right. You make deals with Iran where you can make deals with them in order to prevent them from getting nuclear capacity, but you remain tough on them in other dimensions. You have to negotiate or talk to your rivals as opposed to, just shutting them out. So my view is, I think if it, you notice a lot. I had this realization when I was watching one of the Republican presidential debates, and I can't remember who it was, but I want to say it was Marco Rubio, but it may have been Ted Cruz, and so you can't edit this out, so I'm just going to say.
We can edit it out.
No. Let's keep it real. I don't remember who it was, but somebody referred to the Shia crescent. Right, this idea of the Shias sort of taking over this crescent all the way from Iran to Lebanon, et cetera. And I thought, wow, why are our politicians adopting the cramped sectarian language of the Middle East? I definitely want more bridges between the United States and the Middle East. I want more cultural back and forth, but not this one. I like us to be above the kind of sectarian squabbles that animate politics in that part of the world. So I do think the reality is that we've been, heavily influenced. And again, I do think myself, for me, it's, I do think the Iranian influence in the Middle East has been mischievous and problematic, and that Iranian ambitions do need to be countered in the Middle East. We cannot be blasé about what Iran is trying to do, but we can be a lot cleverer than we are. I think we're kind of adopting wholesale the prejudices of some of our allies, particularly the allies in my part of the Middle East. I'm not sure that's good for us or for them.
Are we seeing a coalition? Israel and Saudi Arabia, as you mentioned, historically have not been on great terms, but now that they have a common enemy, not to mention that it's also been, Iran has driven some wedges between Saudi Arabia and its Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC partners, Qatar being the most prominent example. Are we seeing a shifting dynamic where what traditionally enemies are now kind of coming together against Iran? There's sort of a balance happening. Is that?
I definitely think that you're absolutely right that ties between Gulf countries or Middle Eastern Arab countries, Arab Muslim majority countries, and Israel are becoming closer as a result of this sense of shared enmity towards Iran. I was just in Israel, and everybody in Israel, I guess, thought I was from Oman because my title is the Sultan of Oman professor. And Arabs would say, why is your government meeting with Netanyahu? Because Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had just been there. And so there absolutely is this sense that there's a lot more public cooperation, et cetera, between Israel and the Arab countries. And look, myself as somebody who's really, for as long as I can remember, been committed to the idea of peace and coexistence between Israel and its Arab neighbors and Israelis and Palestinians. On the one hand, I like it, right, when Arab countries and Israel cooperate on things. On the other hand, I do ask myself, if you think about Saudi Arabia, right, I was raised in Saudi Arabia, and I was raised on a steady diet of anti-Israeli rhetoric, right? We were told this is completely legitimate. You're taught that close to the Day of Judgment, there will be a great battle between believers and the Jews, and it will get to the point where the trees and the rocks will come and tell you, here, the Jew is here, come and kill.
What do you think about when you hear that sort of stuff? What do you think?
Well, here's what I think. I think it's absolutely insane, right? But the point is now But the fact of the matter is these governments have these populations that, for reasons of some of this indoctrination, but also for reasons of the natural solidarity that you would expect between Arab citizens and Palestinians who, are living under occupation. For both of these reasons, right, you have populations who don't view Israel as an ally. And so you've got a government, though, that does view Israel as an ally because of Iran. And so how are they going to get their populations on board with them? Well, what they're going to have to do is stoke anti-Iranian sentiment. And what does that stoking of anti-Iranian sentiment usually look like? It looks like stoking really base sectarian sentiment. The Shias, they're the worst, they're the enemy, etc. And so you then think to yourself, like, this is how we're going to liberalize this part of the world, by trading one hatred for another hatred?
Yeah.
So I'm not sure.
You're skeptical about MBS's ability.
I'm skeptical, and I'm skeptical. If I were the Israelis, I'm not sure that the foundation for cooperation, I would want the foundation for my cooperation with the Arab world to be based on, the stoking of sectarian.
It's
sentiment.
almost like the flavor of the day. I mean, you don't see him as maybe he's sort of styling himself as a modern day Ataturk,
Yes.
of course, and so. But he seems to be picking a lot of fights with a lot of different people. Is that a false image?
I think you're absolutely right that he was sort of being touted as what I like to say, like a pocket Ataturk. I definitely would like the Crown Prince's modernizing agenda, the agenda for liberating Saudi women, the agenda for modernizing the economy, for weaning it off of its reliance on oil. I would like that agenda to succeed. Right? So the question is, what is the potential for success? And MBS is very different from Ataturk. So Ataturk was an autocrat, but he never spoke against democracy, or at least, somebody again might watch this and tell me, no, in such and such day he did. But, he tried to institute a republican form of government. And this is, to me, quite remarkable because Ataturk was operating at a time in which democracy was in pretty bad odor around the world, right? And in the cradle of democracy, right? In Europe, you had, fascist movements who were explicitly anti-democratic. But then I got this guy, Ataturk, who's saying, I'm setting up a republic, right? So Mohammed bin Salman isn't doing that, right? So Ataturk had a political discourse that was democratizing, at least, or that was about setting up a government that was formally democratic. That is not what we have in Saudi Arabia. And then Ataturk had, he just inherited a very different political landscape. Remember, this is the guy who, after the conclusion of World War I, he's the one who rescues modern-day Turkey from complete dismemberment, right, by the invading powers, British, Greece, etc. And so And he was the guy. He was the leader. He was the Ghazi,
He had
right?
cred.
Yeah. So he had an enormous amount of cred. So I like to say, if he told, so one of the things he did was he said, we got to stop wearing the traditional Turkish headgear, the fez, and you have to wear, or what we call in Egypt, the tarbush, and you have to wear, regular Western hats. If he told people they had to wear beanies with propellers on their heads, they might have done it. So great was his political credibility. And I don't see Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman enjoying that same amount of political credibility. In fact, as you note, to get to be the Crown Prince, he had to engage in a lot of Game of Thrones-like intrigue that left a lot of people feeling very bruised. And so you do have, even within Saudi Arabia, within the royal family, a lot of people are just waiting to settle scores with him. And then, so he's got all these fights he's opened up with members of the royal family. And then he makes the religious establishment a little annoyed because he's trying to modernize on things that they care about. And then he's opened another front with Iran. And he's opened yet another front with the Muslim Brotherhood, which, if you believe my enemy's enemy is my friend, that doesn't seem terribly
Kidnapped
wise.
the Lebanese prime minister.
Kidnaps the Lebanese prime minister, kidnapped a bunch of his, country's largest businessmen and members of the royal family. Now, kidnapped them in a way that maybe was quite civilized. They get put up in the Ritz-Carlton, but still.
One or two die or something?
Yeah, there are absolutely allegations of torture and other abuses. So but the point is, he's really opened a lot of fronts for himself, and so the question is, how will this resolve itself? It's
hard to say.
Hard to say.
Before we end, you brought something special. I know we're almost out of time.
Well, yeah. Well, I totally forgot that I brought this, but I was going to say.
You're the first person who actually brought a counter snack.
I'm an Arab, and I'm constitutionally incapable of showing up empty-handed, but I also am trying to empty out my pantry, and so we have a bunch of this. This is what is called Turkish delight or lokum,
I love Turkish delight. What exactly is this? Because they're different types, right?
So this Turkish delight, I think, is dusted with coconut and has some pistachio in it. The substance is, I really don't know. It's probably a lot of cornstarch. It's like some kind of gelatiny.
It's gelatinous, right?
Yeah, but we don't. They don't use gelatin. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, they don't.
Yeah,
so
they do. Well, or they probably use beef gelatin, but I doubt that this one has gelatin in it. I think it's like cornstarch and some lemon juice and other things. Again, somebody watching this might know the precise recipe.
Pistachios.
Yeah, but very good with coffee, I find. So again, as my palate has become a little bit more sophisticated. When I was a kid, whenever somebody would bring a box of these, you'd always tell your parents, afterwards, don't invite those people again. When I was a kid, I used to like that people would bring these tins of British chocolate. We're like, invite those guys over again. But now as I get older, I like coffee, and I really like Turkish delight with coffee.
Man. Yeah, there's some that are rose flavored, and there are many types of flavorings that they have.
Okay, I'm not going to cover the mic.
This is too good. Well, Tarek, thank you. Thank you for the snacks.
Enjoy.
That was uncalled for, but it was extremely well appreciated.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Aroop. This is great. Thank you. Awesome.
We just had Dr. Tarek Masoud, the Professor of Public Policy and Sultan of Oman, Professor of International Relations at the Harvard Kennedy School. This is Snack Break. I'm Aroop Mukharji, and to view more episodes, please visit our website at snackbreakshow.com.